August 1945. World War II has just ended. American occupation forces are moving into Japan, beginning the process of holding war criminals accountable. The Tokyo trials, Japan's equivalent of Nuremberg, are being planned. But there's a problem the public doesn't know about. American intelligence has discovered something during the occupation. Evidence of a Japanese military unit that conducted experiments on human subjects. Not just experiments, systematic, methodical torture disguised as medical research. The unit had a bland, bureaucratic name, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But everyone who knew about it called it by a different designation, Unit 731. They operated in occupied Manchuria, in northeastern China. For over a decade, they conducted biological warfare research using live human subjects. Men, women, children, referred to not as people but as logs or monkeys. The experiments were beyond comprehension. Vivisection without anesthesia. Deliberate infection with plague, cholera, anthrax. Freezing experiments. Pressure experiments. Weapons testing on living humans. Thousands died. Maybe tens of thousands. The exact number will never be known because Unit 731 destroyed most of their records before the Americans arrived. But here's the part that should disturb you most. The people responsible were never prosecuted at the Tokyo trials. They never faced justice for crimes against humanity that rivaled anything done by the Nazis. Why? Because the United States made a deal. We granted them immunity in exchange for their research data. Data obtained through the torture and murder of thousands of people. This is the story of Unit 731. The atrocity the victors chose to cover up. The war crime we decided not to prosecute because we wanted the results. To understand Unit 731, you need to understand Japan in the 1930s. The military had enormous power. Japan was expanding aggressively into China. And within the military, there was a faction obsessed with biological warfare. The man who created Unit 731 was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. He was a microbiologist, a charismatic officer, and a man convinced that biological weapons would be decisive in modern warfare. Ishii understood that Japan lacked the industrial capacity to match Western powers in conventional weapons. But biological weapons? Those could be cheap, devastating, and difficult to defend against. A single plane could spread plague across an entire city. He convinced the Japanese military leadership to fund his research. In 1936, Unit 731 was officially established in Pingfang, a district near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, northeastern China. The facility was massive. Over 150 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. There were barracks, laboratories, crematoria, testing grounds, and a 3-story building designated as the prison where human subjects were held. From the outside, it looked like a lumber mill or administrative complex. But inside, it was a factory of death. Unit 731 referred to their human test subjects as Maryuta, logs. This wasn't just dehumanizing language. It was operational security. If anyone overheard conversations about the facility, talking about logs would suggest lumber processing, not human experimentation. Who were these logs? Primarily Chinese civilians accused of being anti-Japanese. Some were actual resistance fighters or criminals. Many were simply people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, arrested by the Japanese military police and sent to Unit 731. There were also Soviet soldiers captured near the border, Mongolians, Koreans, and some Allied prisoners of war. Men, women, and children. Age and gender didn't matter. Anyone could become a research subject. Once people were sent to Unit 731, they never left alive. The unit couldn't allow survivors who could testify to what happened. Everyone who entered the facility was either used in experiments until death or killed when they were no longer needed. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 people died in Unit 731's experiments. Some historians believe the number was much higher, possibly 10,000 or more, especially when you include field tests and satellite facilities. Warning: this section describes extreme medical atrocities. Unit 731's experiments fell into several categories: all designed to advance biological warfare capabilities or general medical knowledge through methods that completely disregarded human suffering. Vivisection. This was the most common fate for test subjects. Researchers would infect prisoners with diseases, plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, tuberculosis, and then, at various stages of infection, would dissect them alive without anesthesia to observe the disease's progression. Why without anesthesia? The researchers claimed anesthesia would affect the results. The reality is they wanted to see how the disease affected living, functioning organs. They wanted to observe the body's responses in real time. Prisoners would be strapped to tables and dissected while fully conscious. Some experiments involved removing organs one by one to see how long a person could survive. These weren't surgeries, they were systematic destruction of human beings for research data. Frostbite experiments. Manchuria is bitterly cold in winter. Unit 731 conducted extensive frostbite research, ostensibly to help Japanese soldiers fighting in cold climates. Prisoners would be taken outside in freezing weather, often with limbs exposed. Water would be poured on their arms or legs, which would then freeze solid. Researchers would test different methods of treating frostbite. They discovered that rapid rewarming in hot water caused the frozen limbs to rot and fall off, while gradual rewarming was more effective. This knowledge came from freezing prisoners' limbs, thawing them, observing the results, and often freezing them again to repeat the experiment. Some prisoners had limbs frozen and thawed repeatedly. Others were frozen to death to observe the stages of hypothermia. Women were subjected to these experiments while pregnant to observe effects on fetuses. Pressure experiments. To understand how altitude affects the human body, relevant for pilots, prisoners were placed in pressure chambers. The air pressure would be dramatically increased or decreased to observe the effects. At extreme low pressure, subjects' eyes would bulge from their sockets. Blood vessels would burst. Internal organs would expand. These experiments were conducted until death, with researchers carefully documenting each stage of suffering. Weapons testing. Unit 731 developed biological weapons and needed to test their effectiveness. Prisoners were used as targets. They would be tied to posts and exposed to bombs containing plague-infected fleas, anthrax spores, or other biological agents. Flamethrowers and conventional weapons were also tested on living prisoners to observe wound patterns and survival times. Prisoners were exposed to lethal doses of X-rays to study radiation effects. Disease transmission studies. Researchers wanted to understand how diseases spread. They would infect prisoners with various diseases and then force them to interact with healthy prisoners to observe transmission rates. They tested sexually transmitted diseases by forcing infected prisoners to rape uninfected prisoners. They tested mother-to-child transmission by infecting pregnant women and observing effects on fetuses and infants. Surgical experiments. Unit 731 performed numerous unnecessary surgeries to train surgeons. Prisoners would have organs removed and transplanted, limbs amputated and reattached, stomach and intestines rearranged, all without medical justification, purely for practice and data collection. Some of these experiments had no scientific value whatsoever. They were torture for its own sake, conducted by people who had completely abandoned any sense of human empathy. Who were the people conducting these experiments? They weren't sadistic outliers. They were trained doctors, scientists, and medical researchers. Many had prestigious university degrees. They were intelligent, educated professionals who convinced themselves they were conducting important scientific research. They rationalized the suffering they inflicted as necessary for the advancement of medical knowledge and Japanese military superiority. Shiro Ishii, the unit's commander, was a medical doctor with degrees from Kyoto Imperial University. He was known as charming and persuasive, able to convince subordinates that their work was patriotic and scientifically valuable. The researchers included some of Japan's leading microbiologists and physicians. After the war, many would return to prominent positions in Japanese medicine and academia. Some became university professors, department heads, even presidents of pharmaceutical companies. They took photographs and kept meticulous records. They published papers, sometimes in Japanese medical journals, though obscuring the fact that the research subjects were human. They treated this work as a career advancement opportunity. The most disturbing aspect: there's little evidence that most of them felt any guilt. They saw Chinese prisoners as less than human, as resources to be used. The dehumanizing language, calling prisoners logs, made it psychologically easier to torture and kill them. Unit 731 didn't just conduct experiments in laboratories. They field-tested their biological weapons on actual populations. Starting in 1940, Unit 731 conducted biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities. The method varied, but the goal was always the same: infect populations with deadly diseases and observe the results. Ningbo, 1940. Japanese planes dropped wheat and rice mixed with plague-infected fleas over the city. Within weeks, plague broke out. At least 99 people died, possibly many more. The outbreak continued spreading to nearby areas. Changde, 1941. Another aerial attack with plague-infected fleas. Estimates suggest around 7,643 people died in the resulting plague epidemic that spread through the region. Other attacks. Unit 731 contaminated water supplies with cholera and typhoid. They distributed plague-infected food in Chinese villages. They released plague-infected rats in populated areas. These weren't military targets. These were deliberate attacks on civilian populations designed to test the effectiveness of biological weapons and gather data on disease spread. The death toll from these field tests is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest at least 200,000 Chinese civilians died from diseases deliberately spread by Unit 731. Some estimates go much higher, possibly 400,000 or more when you include secondary infections and epidemic spread. Think about that. Unit 731 may have killed more people through biological warfare than died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And almost nobody knows about it. Unit 731 was the main facility, but it wasn't the only one. The Japanese military established multiple biological warfare units throughout occupied territory. Unit 100, focused on biological weapons against livestock and crops, also experimented on humans. Unit 516, chemical weapons research and human experiments. Unit 1644, another biological warfare unit in Nanking, conducting similar experiments to Unit 731. There were others: satellite facilities, testing grounds, field units. The entire system was extensive and well-funded. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was institutional, military-sanctioned atrocity on an industrial scale. To keep Unit 731 supplied with test subjects, the Japanese military police established a system for acquiring logs. In occupied China, arrests were easy. The military police would round up people accused of espionage, resistance activity, or simply being in areas of partisan activity. Many arrests were arbitrary, quotas had to be filled. Prisoners would be transferred to Unit 731 in railway cars, sometimes told they were being taken to a labor camp. Upon arrival, they were stripped, shaved, and assigned numbers. They lost their names. They were inventory. The prison within Unit 731 could hold several hundred prisoners at a time. Conditions were deliberately designed to keep prisoners weak but alive long enough for experimentation. Food was minimal, sanitation poor, medical care non-existent except as part of experiments. Prisoners knew what awaited them. Those who had been there longer could hear the screams from the laboratories. The smell of the crematoria was constant. Some prisoners tried to commit suicide, but the facility was designed to prevent even that escape. How did educated medical professionals participate in such atrocities? Several psychological factors enabled the horror. Dehumanization. The use of terms like logs and monkeys made it easier to view prisoners as research material rather than people. Japanese propaganda portrayed Chinese as racially inferior, less than fully human. Authority and obedience. Military hierarchy and Japanese cultural emphasis on obedience meant orders were followed without question. Refusing to participate would have been seen as disloyal and could have consequences. Professional ambition. Working at Unit 731 was considered prestigious in military medical circles. Researchers could publish papers, advance their careers. The human cost was externalized. Moral disengagement. Researchers convinced themselves the work served a higher purpose, protecting Japanese soldiers, advancing medical science, serving the nation. Individual suffering was rationalized as necessary sacrifice. Normalization. Over time, the atrocities became routine. The first vivisection might have been difficult, but the 100th was just another day at work. Evil becomes banal when repeated. Group dynamics. Everyone around you is participating, no one is objecting, the institution validates the work. This creates powerful pressure to conform. Dissent would mark you as an outsider. These are the same psychological mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and other mass atrocities. Normal people, under the right conditions, can commit unthinkable acts. As the war turned against Japan, Unit 731 began preparing to destroy evidence. By August 1945, with Soviet forces advancing into Manchuria, Ishii gave the order to eliminate all traces of the unit's activities. Prisoners still alive were killed. Buildings were dynamited. Documents were burned. Equipment was destroyed. The massive crematoria worked overtime burning evidence. But they couldn't destroy everything. Some documents survived. Some buildings remained partially intact. And most importantly, the researchers themselves carried the knowledge of what they'd done. When American forces arrived to occupy Japan, they began to discover evidence of Unit 731's existence. At first, it seemed like Japan's version of Nazi medical experiments, horrific crimes that would be prosecuted at war crimes trials. But then American military intelligence made a calculation that would haunt history. American occupation forces and intelligence operatives began interviewing Japanese scientists and military personnel in the fall of 1945. During these interviews, information about Unit 731 started to emerge. At first, the Japanese were evasive. But as American investigators pressed, offering various incentives and assurances, some participants began to provide details, not out of remorse, but because they wanted to bargain. The Americans learned that Unit 731 had conducted extensive biological warfare research using human subjects. They learned about the vivisections, the disease experiments, the field tests, and they learned that Unit 731 had accumulated an enormous amount of data that the United States didn't have and couldn't ethically obtain. This presented a dilemma. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors were being prosecuted for medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The principle was clear. Such experiments were crimes against humanity, and the data obtained through them was tainted by its evil origins. But biological warfare was different. This wasn't just medical research, it was weapons research. And the United States was entering the Cold War, increasingly concerned about Soviet capabilities. The data from Unit 731 could give America an advantage. A decision was made at high levels of the American military and intelligence establishment. Obtain the data, and in exchange, grant the researchers immunity from prosecution. The exact details of the negotiations remain partially classified, but the outline is clear. American officials, particularly from the Army's Camp Detrick biological warfare program and military intelligence, approached Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders with a deal. The offer: provide complete documentation of all research conducted by Unit 731. Cooperate fully with American debriefers. Share all knowledge about biological warfare research and results. In exchange, the United States would not prosecute them for war crimes. They would not be handed over to the Soviets or Chinese, who were demanding them for trial. They would be allowed to return to civilian life in Japan. The researchers accepted. Between 1946 and 1948, extensive debriefing sessions occurred. Unit 731 researchers provided thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and data to American officials. The Americans paid for this information. Approximately $200,000 was given to Unit 731 researchers for their cooperation, equivalent to over $3 million today. The blood of thousands of victims was quite literally sold for American dollars. There's no ambiguity here. American officials knew exactly what they were covering up. The reports they received described the experiments in detail, the vivisections, the frostbite tests, the pressure chamber experiments, all of it. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, was informed. He approved the immunity deal. So did officials in Washington, including the War Department and likely President Truman's administration. Documents that have been declassified show that American officials explicitly discussed the moral implications and decided that military advantage outweighed justice. One memo noted that the information was of such importance that it far outweighs the war crimes aspects. Think about what that means. American officials made a conscious decision that scientific data obtained through torture and mass murder, was more valuable than prosecuting crimes against humanity. The Soviet Union was also investigating Unit 731. They captured some researchers who didn't make it to American-controlled zones. In December 1949, the Soviets held the Khabarovsk war crime trials, prosecuting 12 members of Unit 731. The trials provided extensive testimony about Unit 731's activities. Defendants described the experiments, the victims, the organizational structure. The Soviets presented evidence and witness testimony. But in the West, these trials were dismissed as Soviet propaganda. After all, the accused were making wild, unbelievable claims about biological warfare and human experimentation. And American intelligence, which knew the claims were true, actively worked to discredit the trials. The Cold War context meant that anything the Soviets said was viewed with suspicion in the West. Soviet evidence of Unit 731's crimes was portrayed as communist fabrication meant to embarrass Japan and the United States. This was a lie. The Soviets were telling the truth, and American officials knew it. But geopolitics trumped truth. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo trials, ran from 1946 to 1948. They prosecuted major Japanese war criminals for crimes including murder, torture, and crimes against humanity. But Unit 731 was never mentioned. Not once. The entire biological warfare program was omitted from the trials. Chinese prosecutors wanted to bring evidence of biological warfare attacks. They were quietly discouraged by American officials. The Chinese had witnesses, evidence of plague attacks on their cities, but these charges were never formally presented. Why? Because prosecuting Unit 731 would require revealing the American immunity deal. It would expose that the U.S. had covered up crimes comparable to those being prosecuted at Nuremberg. It would reveal that American had paid war criminals for their data. So Unit 731 was erased from the official record of Japanese war crimes. The Tokyo trials convicted multiple Japanese leaders and executed 7, including Prime Minister Tojo. But the men who conducted systematic human experimentation and killed tens of thousands through biological warfare walked free. The American decision represents one of the most morally indefensible acts in U.S. history. Let's be clear about what happened. The United States granted immunity to mass murderers, people who tortured thousands to death, who conducted biological warfare attacks on civilian populations, who committed crimes that rivaled the worst Nazi atrocities. We did this knowingly. Officials understood exactly what these men had done. They had the evidence, the photographs, the detailed reports. We did this for data, not to save lives, not to prevent imminent threats, but to gain military advantage in the emerging Cold War. We valued biological warfare research more than justice for victims. We covered it up. We suppressed evidence, discouraged prosecution by allies, and allowed the perpetrators to return to respectable positions in Japanese society. And we used the data. American biological warfare programs incorporated research obtained from Unit 731. Knowledge gained through torture and murder informed American military research. There's no moral equivalence to be drawn here, no everyone does it rationalization. This was a deliberate choice to prioritize military advantage over basic human morality and justice. After receiving immunity from the United States, Unit 731 researchers returned to civilian life in Japan. Many had successful careers. Shiro Ishii, retired from military service, lived comfortably in Tokyo. He worked briefly as a consultant for the American Biological Warfare Program. He died of throat cancer in 1959, age 67, never prosecuted, never imprisoned. Masaji Kitano succeeded Ishii as Unit 731 commander, later became a professor at Tokyo University and ran a pharmaceutical company. Died 1986. Ryoichi Nato went on to found Green Cross Corporation, a major pharmaceutical company. Under his leadership, the company was later involved in a scandal involving HIV-contaminated blood products, unrelated to Unit 731, but showing his continued disregard for human welfare. Many others became university professors, researchers, medical practitioners, business leaders. Some published research without revealing the sources of their data that influenced Japanese and international medicine. They lived normal, comfortable lives. They were never held accountable. Many died of old age, surrounded by family, their pasts unknown to most people around them. For decades, the full story of Unit 731 remained suppressed. In Japan, it was virtually unknown. Textbooks didn't mention it, the government didn't acknowledge it. In the United States, documents remained classified. Why the continued secrecy? Several reasons. American complicity. Revealing Unit 731 meant revealing the immunity deal and American use of data obtained through atrocities. This would be politically and morally embarrassing. Cold War priorities. During the Cold War, Japan was a crucial American ally. Exposing Japanese war crimes that America had covered up would strain the relationship. Japanese politics. Conservative political forces in Japan, many with connections to wartime leadership, preferred to forget uncomfortable history. Acknowledging Unit 731 meant acknowledging Japanese atrocities in China. Scientific community. Researchers who had used data derived from Unit 731, often unknowingly, but sometimes knowingly, didn't want to confront the ethical implications. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that substantial information about Unit 731 began to emerge publicly, as documents were gradually declassified and researchers in Japan, China, and the West began investigating seriously. To this day, the Japanese government has never fully acknowledged the scale of Unit 731's crimes or offered adequate compensation to victims and their families. In 2002, a Japanese court ruled that Unit 731 had conducted biological warfare and human experimentation, but rejected compensation claims on technical grounds. The ruling acknowledged the facts but provided no remedy. Some individual Japanese politicians and officials have acknowledged Unit 731, but there's been no official government apology comparable to German acknowledgement of Holocaust crimes. In China, where most victims came from, there's deep anger about this lack of accountability. Unit 731 remains a source of tension in Sino-Japanese relations. The United States has never officially apologized for granting immunity to Unit 731 researchers. The immunity deal was only declassified incrementally, and even now, some documents remain classified. The victims of Unit 731 have no memorial comparable to Holocaust memorials. Most remain nameless. The exact number will never be known because the records were destroyed. In China, there are some memorials and museums dedicated to Unit 731 victims. The site of the Pingfang facility has been preserved as a museum. But internationally, awareness remains limited. Think about this. Everyone knows about Nazi medical experiments. Joseph Mengele is infamous. The Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics was created in direct response to Nazi crimes. Medical students learn about the importance of informed consent and ethical research specifically because of Holocaust atrocities. But how many people know about Unit 731? How many medical students learn this history? How many ethics courses discuss the implications of American use of data obtained through torture? The victims, Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Koreans, Mongolians, Allied POWs, were denied justice in their lifetimes and have been largely forgotten by history. The Unit 731 case has lasting implications. Medical ethics. It raises profound questions about the use of data obtained unethically. Should research derived from atrocities ever be used? Does using it validate the crimes? Medical ethics still grapples with these questions. War crimes prosecution. The immunity deal set a dangerous precedent. It showed that strategic interests can override justice. This pattern would repeat. Nazi scientists brought to America through Operation Paperclip, Cold War-era tolerance of Allied dictatorships' human rights abuses. Historical memory. The suppression of Unit 731 history demonstrates how wartime allies can rewrite history together. What we remember and what we forget is often determined by political convenience rather than moral importance. Sino-Japanese relations. Japan's failure to adequately acknowledge Unit 731 and other wartime atrocities remains a major source of tension with China and Korea. Historical grievances continue to affect contemporary politics. Scientific community. The case raises questions about scientific knowledge obtained through unconscionable means. How should researchers today treat data that originated from Unit 731? This question has never been satisfactorily resolved. The Unit 731 case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was the American decision pragmatic or immoral? Can the ends military advantage scientific knowledge ever justify such means, granting immunity to mass murderers? Should data obtained through torture and murder ever be used? Does using it honor victims by ensuring their suffering wasn't entirely meaningless? Or does it validate and incentivize such research? How do we balance truth, justice, and political reality? Should war crimes prosecution ever be subordinated to geopolitical considerations? What do we owe victims of atrocities committed by our allies? Do Chinese victims of Unit 731 deserve less justice than European Holocaust victims because Japan became America's ally? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They have real implications for how we understand justice, morality, and historical memory. Unit 731 operated for approximately 9 years, from 1936 to 1945. In that time, at least 3,000 people, possibly 10,000 or more, died in direct experimentation. Tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, died from biological warfare attacks on Chinese cities. All were denied justice. The perpetrators lived comfortable lives. They were never punished. Some became wealthy. Some were honored as respected scientists and businessmen. They died peacefully, their crimes largely unknown. The United States obtained the research data and covered up the crimes. We made a deliberate choice to prioritize military advantage over justice and moral principle. The victims remain mostly nameless, mostly forgotten. Their suffering was erased from the official historical record for decades. Even now, Unit 731 remains less known than comparable Nazi atrocities. If the story has a moral, it's this: justice deferred is justice denied. The geopolitical calculations that led America to grant immunity to Unit 731 may have seemed pragmatic in 1946, but they represent a moral failure that echoes through history. We tell ourselves that we're different from the regimes we defeated in World War II. We prosecuted Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. We established principles of international law and human rights. We claimed moral high ground. But Unit 731 reveals the lie. When it was convenient, when we wanted something, we made the same calculation that enables all atrocities. Some lives matter less than others. Some crimes can be forgiven if the perpetrators have something we want. The Chinese victims of Unit 731 deserved the same justice as European Holocaust victims. They didn't receive it because they weren't politically convenient. Their suffering was deemed less important than American military research and alliance with Japan. Right now, in 2024, some documents about the American immunity deal remain classified. The full extent of American knowledge and complicity is still not completely public. The Japanese government has still not adequately acknowledged Unit 731 or compensated victims' families. Many Japanese citizens remain unaware of this history. The medical and scientific data obtained from Unit 731, data obtained through torture and murder, influenced biological warfare research and possibly medical knowledge that's used today. We've never fully reckoned with what it means to use knowledge derived from atrocity. And the precedent stands. If war criminals have something we want, scientific knowledge, intelligence information, strategic value, we're willing to forgive unforgivable crimes. Unit 731 represents one of the greatest moral failures in American foreign policy history. We knew about crimes comparable to the worst Nazi atrocities. We had the power to pursue justice. We chose not to. We chose data over humanity, strategy over morality, convenience over conscience. Thousands of victims were denied justice so that America could gain military advantage in the Cold War. That's not pragmatism. That's complicity. The experiments conducted by Unit 731 ended in 1945. But the moral stain of America's choice to protect the perpetrators remains, unacknowledged, unresolved, a permanent mark on our claim to moral leadership. Some crimes should never be forgiven, no matter what the perpetrators can offer. Unit 731 proved that when it matters, we don't actually believe that. And that might be the most disturbing revelation of all.